Now, a couple generations ago, federal housing policy, transportation, the building of the highway system, education policy really transformed America's cities and left us with a legacy that many of our cities across the country are still grappling with today, grappling with segregation, widening rural and urban divides, amplified concentrated pockets of poverty in different cities. Now we're in the midst of another incredibly enormous, massive shift in our cities, and it's being fueled in significant part by tech. But I wanted to start this morning with a question about power. As we've seen some of the shifts over the past few years, fueled by companies like Uber and Amazon. Where do you think, and Molly, I'll point this question at you first, and then Mike will invite you to answer afterwards. Who do you think has wielded the most power in shaping America's cities through tech? Has it been the VCs that fueled the capital investment that made something like Uber possible? Has it been the customers that shouted at their cities to bring these innovations to their shores? Has it been the policymakers?
So I think there's no question the VCs have a lot of power, right? They hold the power of the purse, they decide what to invest in, and a lot of them have theses. You know, I believe in the future of autonomous vehicles, so I'm investing all these resources in a future that's autonomous. But if you talk to a lot of VCs, they'll tell you, I'm just responding to what the market tells me the good ideas are, right? The founders come to me and pitch me on their ideas. I'm not seeding ideas with them. And so they'll kind of say, no, it's the founders that have the power. So it's some combination of the two. But then right after they get funding, then these companies need to hire a ton of people. And I think actually right now we underestimate the power of the full-time employees at these tech companies, what they're willing to work on. By the way, engineers at most tech companies don't get told what to work on. They have to opt in to a project. The product manager has to convince them to work on something. So I think actually the full-time employees can wield a lot of power in these companies.
Yeah. Michael, you've served in a lot of different roles over the years. You founded an internet company in Indiana, HoosierNet. You were the chief information officer for Bloomington, Indiana, and now you work at McKinsey. As you look, McKinsey Global Institute, as you look across the landscape at how tech is transforming our cities, who do you think has wielded the most power?
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo a little bit or amplify what Molly said. I think there are questions about where technology will be pointed. In that case, founders and investors make that difference. But I agree, Larry Leska has famously said code is law, right? And the engineers are writing the code, and to a certain extent that is becoming, in quotes, the law in terms of what actually happens. So how this technology gets implemented, a lot of it is being done by the engineers, who in many cases don't know a lot of the history that you just described. And so I think that's where a lot of things are coming together. And I think in recent days, or months, and certainly going forward, the traditional sets of political players now recognize the power that code has in certain sense, and so I think certainly here in San Francisco and elsewhere we're seeing city leaders, the traditional political system now starting to interact in very strong ways.
One last thought on that, and one of the reasons I created this class that I teach at Berkeley is because the investors and the technology leaders that are building these businesses that are totally transforming our cities, for the most part, do not understand how cities work and do not understand what the long-term impacts of their businesses are going to be on cities, or they have one specific vision that misses this whole part. And so I don't know that they're setting out to transform cities in the way that they are actually ending up transforming them. It's kind of an unintended consequence in many ways.
What is your most striking example of either an investor or an engineer or an employee really not understanding the dynamics, the sociology of cities?
Well, I think my favorite example is, and there are many people who have done this lately, who suggest that we invest in hovercrafts to cross the bay to solve our congestion problems. flying cars or any kind of flying vehicle will not solve congestion. It will just create congestion in the sky. They don't understand the law of induced demand. And like if you add an extra lane onto the highway, that just creates more congestion on the highway because more people come out to drive. Like investing in public transportation infrastructure will solve our congestion problems. Congestion pricing will solve our congestion problems, not going in the sky.
Michael, you have researched in your work the effects of automation, what we're likely to see from automation in the American workforce. This is another, in many ways, automation is another force that's likely to have an effect in cities. How do you think that it's going to play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've discovered, I think if you look at a national level, there's almost certainly enough work for people to do, right? In which case, you know, the big challenge might be not mass unemployment, but mass redeployment of labor. That said, you know, as those of us who work in data a lot know, the averages often hide a lot of the interesting things that happen. We just published a report you can download for free from the web just last week, which looked at 3,000 different counties, 300 different cities. It's amazing. If you look in the past decade, for instance, about 2/3 of the job creation came from 25 cities. Going forward, that might be 60% of the jobs that are created. And so there's a real divergence in terms of, you know, one community versus another in the country. And I think that's one of the you know, most important things to do is to you know, take a look at where in fact the impact will be from a geographic standpoint as well as from a demographic standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, to look at, just as a follow-up, to look at one of the things that's getting automated, driving. Autonomous vehicles are beginning to take shape in various ways. If you go onto Berkeley's campus, you see
the little robots. They run into me all the time.
But I have heard two visions for how the rise of autonomous vehicles in cities is going to play out in the ensuing decades. One is a dystopian vision fueled by customers, many of the most moneyed customers in the city who basically take on the city's roads to themselves and hire these vehicles as single passenger services to ferry them from place to place, substantially increasing the congestion and the commute time for folks who don't have access to that pathway. And the other, perhaps, a more egalitarian vision of people sharing in a beautiful vision of our roads flowing seamlessly like water with bikes and scooters ferrying people to their destinations. Which of those two visions do you think is likelier to play out and why?
Me first? All right. On the long term, I generally have an optimistic view. That said, I say long term because it's going to take a long time for this to happen, right? I mean, these systems, they're amazing in some sense. You know, they run in Amali on the Berkeley campus, but, you know, they don't work well when you can't see the lanes. They definitely don't work well in snow. They work sort of bad in rain. I mean, they don't detect stationary objects by the side of the road super well. Those are big problems, right? And so, not even if people start doing adversarial things, trying to break them, right? I mean, you can turn a stop sign into something that looks to an autonomous vehicle like a 35-mile-per-hour sign, right? People will die when that happens. So, you know, it'll take some time for these systems to work. That said, when they do work, hopefully, you know, they'll be more safe. In fact, if you look at the cost of running a ride-sharing operation, you know, a large percentage of that cost is driver cost. And so to a certain extent, you could lower the cost of transportation. That said, will it create induced demand? Probably. And so there will have to be some response if you actually want congestion not to get out of control. And we see congestion pricing coming to some cities like New York. It already exists in London and Singapore and other places. I'm optimistic because I live in sunny California, but it takes a lot of work for that, you know, good outcome to happen.
Yeah. So, Molly, I love your podcast, by the way.
Thank
Technopolis. And one of the things that I think is an often implicit subject of the podcast is this question. When you listen to VCs and you listen to founders talk about what they're trying to do, they talk always about, you know, solving problems, about trying to find big, hopefully remunerative problems to solve for customers. Putatively. But I think one of the questions that's often sort of in the water of that conversation is whose problems are being solved. For whom are the problems being solved and who's solving them? You teach this class called Tech in the City, How to Get Urban Innovation Right. So I'm curious, What is your favorite positive example of a problem being solved for perhaps the most vulnerable of a city's residents?
Oh, I'm going to take a long time to answer that. By a for-profit tech startup?
Not necessarily. Could be a nonprofit co-op like Hoosier Net.
It's hard to find for-profit tech startups that are really solving the most difficult problems for the most vulnerable residents. But I will say it is quite easy to find policymakers who are trying to do that. And at the end of the day, one of the things that I teach my students and we say on the podcast a lot, and this goes back to the autonomous vehicle conversation, right? I think autonomous vehicles certainly have a place, right? And autonomy might reduce traffic incidents and deaths, which is something we really need to fix. But if you want to go back to what the tech community likes to call first principles thinking, right? What is the problem we are trying to solve with autonomous vehicles? It's getting from point A to point B the most efficiently, sustainably, and safely as possible for everybody. There are lots of other ways to do that than autonomous vehicles, right? And by the way, autonomous vehicles could help us do that, but it's not the technology that's going to do that. It's making really difficult policy decisions that will help us do that, making sure that they're shared, making sure that they're electric, making sure that we reserve space for all the scooters and bikes and pedestrians, which, by the way, do not go well with autonomous vehicles, at least right now. And so at the end of the day, I think policy making is where we're going to have the biggest impact and be able to leverage the most resources for the most good. And I think the for-profit tech companies can certainly play a role in augmenting the implementation of these policies. But at the end of the day, we can't get around making some of these really tough decisions.
Yeah. You each, in addition to serving in the private sector, have also played roles in the public sector, working for city governments. Michael, you were the chief information officer for Bloomington, Indiana. And from that vantage point, how do you think companies should be engaging most productively with cities to make sure that they are keeping the lowest income residents and residents who fundamentally need a transit infrastructure the most front and center?
I think engaging at all is a positive thing. I mean, there's a history of tech companies trying to avoid engaging in public policy. I think that day is over. It's clear that the tech companies realize that as well. And so I think a lot of mutual understanding has to happen, right? I mean, if you look at the number of policymakers who have a deep understanding of tech, it's relatively low. And as I mentioned before, the number of engineers who have a deep understanding or a recognition of history is relatively low. And so we need to raise the waterline in knowledge and understanding on both sides.
I'm going to ask one more question before I take one or two from our crowd here this morning. But Molly, how do you think that residents of a city stand to exercise the most power? How do they actually exercise influence over what technological interventions are perhaps being foisted upon them? Do they have the most agency, again, as users of apps? Or is it through political organization, through policy?
I think both. I think we shouldn't underestimate the power we as consumers have to use or not use these apps. I think when the Uber and Lyft IPOs happened, we finally got to see some data about the impact of the Delete Uber campaign, which was pretty significant. I don't know if that'll be a long-term impact, but I think we shouldn't underestimate that power. But I also think at the end of the day, policy is how we're going to have the most power over this. And some democracies work better than others. But look, we saw 3 scooter companies launched in San Francisco over a year ago, and within 2 weeks, the Board of Supervisors changed the law to basically make that illegal. I mean, that's pretty quick policy making, especially for a city like San Francisco. I don't know that that necessarily reflected the general sentiment of the population of San Francisco, but it can be done if you have the will.
Let's go to a question from the audience. We've got one up here. Oh, we've got a microphone coming your way.
Hi, my name is Donna Hunter, and I teach at Stanford. And I was really interested in what you were just saying now about policy, the connection between policymakers and tech companies, and the example that you just used. And I'm wondering, how do we incentivize more policymakers to want to actually help those that are the most vulnerable that we're talking about, rather than just focusing on capital? Because being a long-time resident of San Francisco, I know that's not always the case.
Thank you.
Elect the right people. If you don't, yeah, I mean, if you don't like how your elected officials are voting, vote them out and elect someone new.
Yeah, voting matters. That said, also, like, having served in city government, money matters too. I mean, we can't do a bunch of stuff in city government without, taxes and economic development and all those things. I mean, we didn't even go into taxes yet, but
Yeah.
I have sympathy for people in positions of power, but voting that's how we express.
I will give you a more robust answer, especially for San Francisco. So a good friend of mine, Warren Logan, who just started in the city of Oakland, actually was at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, and he led the development of this emerging mobility technology plan, which was basically helping the city and county of San Francisco think about what are the future mobility technologies going to be that might, quote unquote, disrupt things in San Francisco, and how can we as the city government prepare for that future and tell these investors and tech startups, if you are solving these kinds of problems, we will open the door for you. We will gladly help you. We will collaborate. We will figure out how to pilot this. If you're not focused on the kinds of problems that we think are serving the neediest folks in San Francisco, we're not going to help you. And in fact, we might erect barriers. And so I think more cities can actually prepare for these unknown futures by articulating their values and saying, if you share those same values, then we can work together in these ways.
We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Liz Redmond Cleveland. I'm the Chief Strategist of Sustainable Growth at the City of Berkeley. And I work in our Office of Economic Development, and I work a lot with our entrepreneurs and our Berkeley Startup Cluster. And my question is, other than taking your class at Haas, how do we increase the education of the entrepreneurs in our community or the tech sector workers about the role that they have to play, whether they're tech workers in Berkeley working elsewhere or that run startups or tech companies in Berkeley? How do we increase their knowledge about governments and about the role that they can play in supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Great question. Okay, I think people who are leaders, people in city government, I think, number one, it will be required. I mean, as I said before, the tech folks realize, in fact, that engaging with public policy is just, it's unavoidable now. But I also think on the other side of the coin, reaching out can be quite powerful. Now, not every door is going to be open, but I think more doors are going to open now that these topics have really become part of the public policy dialogue.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what percentage of tech founders got a master's degree in whatever field they're starting their company in. I imagine it's probably low. So I don't know how many of them are required to take computer engineering ethics classes or other things that I know are in a lot of curricula at different schools. I think something actually aforementioned Warren Logan did, which is really interesting, is going to the investors and talking to the investors and saying, here's some things that I want you to understand if you're investing in mobility startups. Here's some things you need to understand about mobility. And so maybe they will take that into account as they invest in some of these companies and as they advise some of their portfolio companies. But I will say this is something that I always tell my students, and I always bring in a journalist every semester, because I think the power of the press is really, really influential. Many of the companies that I've advised in the past and worked for, they only made the really hard decisions on really difficult social issues when the press was on them every day reporting on it. And so I think having really great journalists reporting on this will probably have the greatest impact.
I like that ending point. Wide-ranging conversation. We'll be getting into a lot of these topics in more depth throughout the day. So thank you very much for listening to us this morning. Molly and Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.